Hi, it's Erica Ives here, CEO at Mindful Path, and today we have our amazing dietitian, Taryn Mcpherson, with us. Hi, Taryn.
Hi,
How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm wonderful, and I'm so happy to be here with you today.
Me too.
Today, Taryn and I are going to chat a little bit about why diets don't work. So let's dive right in. Taryn,
Okay.
why don't diets work?
So there's a lot of research on why diets don't work. I think what
Mhm,
it really boils down to is that restriction doesn't work. Like if you think of even if you take it away from food, when
mhm,
human beings are told they can't have something or can't do something, that becomes like our sole focus. Like you
mhm,
think of like a teenager that's like, you have to be home by 10 o'clock. Like they're going to push that because
mhm.
we just naturally rebel against those kind of limits. And so then when you take something like food, which is necessary for our survival, right? And then you try to control the intake of it and restrict amounts or types of food, then our thoughts become overwhelmed with the thought of food and what
Mhm.
am I going to eat and when am I going to eat? And it becomes like an obsession, which just completely affects the quality of our lives, right? Like
Uh, right,
all
right.
of the things you could do in your day if you weren't thinking about food every second of every day.
It does take up a lot of time.
Yeah.
And, it is so interesting, right? Like you're talking about food for survival. Well, food also, without it, right? Like you just said, we die. We cannot survive without
Yeah.
food. Yet we have this, our society has such an interesting relationship with food. I think it's truly fascinating,
Hmm.
the society that we live in around food.
Yeah. Yeah, it like blows my mind. Imagine if we had that relationship with oxygen.
Ugh.
If we said things like, okay, well, you've earned your breathing today,
Mhm,
like go ahead
mhm,
and breathe your oxygen.
mhm.
You've earned that.
Right. I mean, it's senseless.
Yeah.
Makes no sense. And what about the concept of diets leading to disordered eating and or eating disorders? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So diets in general, they restrict, and there's different kinds of diets, right? So like there's the ones that just restrict the amount of food people eat. They give like harsh numbers of you can't go over X amount of calories or points or whatever. And so in that way you get very like obsessed numbers wise.
Hmm.
You're reading labels, you're worrying about what is what number. And then there are the diets that vilify specific foods. And a lot of times diets kind of do both at the same time. And so when you have the diets that vilify foods, then we become like very moral in our food choices. We put a lot of morality into food. This food is
Hmm.
good and this is bad,
Hmm.
when in reality it's all just food. And so
Hmm.
both the morality around food choices and the, like I call it food math, all of the numbers that we put can create a very disordered relationship with food,
Right.
because instead of listening to what your body needs and wants in the moment, you're focused on what would make you quote unquote a good person for the day
Hmm.
to eat,
Hmm.
and trying to like calculate what is acceptable and not acceptable. And the
Right.
more that we do that, the more disordered our relationship with food becomes.
Hmm. So you get a lot of individuals who come in and talk to you about some of these fad diets that they're doing. Um, Can you talk a little bit about some of the fad diets that are out there and also why those don't work?
Sure. So a big one right now, obviously, is keto,
Yeah.
which vilifies carbohydrates.
Hmm.
Carbohydrates are our body's main source of energy. So vilifying them doesn't make a lot of sense scientifically. Like we need them in order for our brain to work and our heart and muscles in general to work. Um, so that's a very like disordered relationship, right? Like taking this main nutrient that needs to be our main source of
Right.
nutrition. So like when you look at the breakdown of what we need in
Mhm.
terms of macronutrients, fats,
Mhm.
proteins, and carbohydrates, the largest quantity that we need of those macronutrients is carbohydrates, because that's what our body needs to function. Another one that's very popular right now is intermittent fasting,
Yeah.
which I have clients that get very like, that's just literally just anorexia. Like you can eat from this time to this time and that's it.
Right.
No more.
Right. 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 And even if you're hungry, ignore your hunger cues because the clock says it's not time to eat yet.
Yes,
Right.
exactly. Yeah,
And
it doesn't
the
matter what you feel. You
right.
have a time period where you're allowed food and that's the only time you're allowed to eat.
Right. And with keto, can you explain a little bit what the keto diet was even intended for in the first place? This is
Sure.
really important information.
Yeah. So keto, the word keto for the diet comes from the term of ketogenesis, which is
Hmm.
where our body is forced to produce ketones because it's going through chemical processes because there's not enough carbohydrates. There were a number of studies done that found that for people with epilepsy where medication was not working, so they tried every medication and the epilepsy was still very active and not well controlled, these patients were put on keto diets and decreased their carbohydrate intake. And within that, it was found to be somewhat successful, obviously more successful than the medication. And so, therefore, improve the quality of these patients' lives.
Right.
But had to happen under really strict medical supervision of
Right.
both a doctor and a dietitian in order to be successful and in order to be safe. And so that's where it comes from, and there is literature around that and scientific studies that prove the usefulness in those instances, but for everybody else that's not the case.
So where did it make that turn that it went from there into, this blasting is the diet, right?
Mhm.
How did that happen?
I feel like I don't know for sure. I
Yeah.
feel like it was a little bit of like we go through phases, right, of fad
Mhm.
diets. So you have like the 90s where fat was really vilified, and then we moved into like the Atkins diet where
Right.
carbohydrates are really vilified. And right now we're really in like a wellness area where people really focus on like, oh, well, this is, for our health and this is science based. And it sort of feels like people took like the carbohydrate vilification from Atkins and then looked for support, right? Like scientific literature support, which, like I said, exists for keto for people
Mhm.
with epilepsy that can't
Mhm.
be controlled through medication. So it's sort of exists there. And then it's like they took it and were like, see, science says this is
Right.
good.
Right.
And
Right.
then like packaged it up and sold it.
Right. And it has blown up and it's
Yeah.
so scary. And, you know, what about clients who, come in, they've been practicing these types of diets for a lot of their life, and then they're going to make this shift. Well, the hope is they're going to make a shift into intuitive eating.
Hmm.
Can you talk a little about that bridge from fad diets into intuitive eating?
Sure. Yeah. So I think that's probably like the scariest part,
Right.
right? Is
Yeah.
that bridge.
Yeah.
Because when we are fully intuitive eaters, we're really aware and listening and like just comfortable with what our body wants. And
Mhm.
there's this transition to get there. And it can feel really scary because for most people, that transition means you're eating a lot of the foods that were off limits and in a lot more quantities than maybe you will be when you shift fully to intuitive eating
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
of that restriction and because
Mhm.
as you start to like, okay, this is allowed, you find you want it more because you haven't had
Right.
it for so long. And so there's this period where it's like kind of like a pendulum, right? Like we fold it all the way this way and it's going to swing. We have to have faith that it's going to settle in the middle. And
Yeah.
that can be really hard and scary to have faith in.
Yeah. Yeah. Managing those emotions can be so overwhelming.
Hmm.
One of the reasons why, therapy is such a great adjunct tool with working with you to also give them more tools, right, to be able to manage the emotions that are probably going to emerge, and all the
Yeah.
thoughts that are going to go along, the maladaptive thoughts.
Yeah.
um
Absolutely.
yeah. So what do you tell clients who have come in, just, dieting has been their way of life, and they are so adamant that it's okay for them to diet? And after that, I do want to also ask you about being vegan and that sort of thing. But if we could just answer that other question first, that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah. So if people come in and they're like, this dieting is the way to do it, I
Yeah.
think usually the first thing I start talking about is like, well, how well has it worked for you?
hmm And some
Let's
of
just
them will
talk
say it
about it.
has,
Yeah.
right? They'll say,
Yeah.
well, I lost so much weight, and that was my intention.
Hmm. Right. And then usually what happens after that is why they come in to see me. It's
Right,
like,
right.
I've done it and I lost this weight and then it came back and more came back. And so it's like, it's this thing that we're sold, right? Diets are like the only thing that we're sold, that when they fail, it's our fault. Like
hmm
if you buy a TV and it stops working within a week, you don't blame yourself.
No, right. So true. So true.
And so I try to give that perspective to people and
hmm
then really like dive into like, okay, so you felt like it worked, but then what happened? Like, did it
hmm
really work?
hmm
Or did it do exactly what it was intending to do, which is
Right.
make you believe that it worked and
hmm
then make you have to come back and do it again, which,
Right.
I mean, it's a product being sold. So, of course, that
hmm
is the goal.
Right. And also talking to them about, like, how's it affecting your quality of life? Are
Hmm.
you are you finding it takes away from your ability to be present in your most intimate type relationships? Is it, how consuming is it? Those sorts of things too,
Yeah.
right? Even
Yeah.
financial
Oh, absolutely.
complications or consequences that come from this too,
Yeah.
right?
Especially now with the more like wellness focused diets where there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of like emphasis on like the organic or like the vegan, which are all very expensive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
so let's move into that, talking about, I know you get a lot of clients who come in and tell you about, being vegan or clean eating. Can you
Hmm.
speak to that a little bit? Because what I notice is sometimes it's not put into the category of diets.
Yeah.
So, and there's this fine line, right,
Right.
of like medical necessity and personal desire.
Yes. And especially I think like with a vegan diet, there is such a fine line between like this is how I feel about our food system and this is like a problem,
Right.
right? Because there are people who are very clear on like their vegan diet is because they disagree with like the way our food system is run, which
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
get.
Right.
And it's also possible to challenge the food system without having to be so restrictive.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a client that I work with right now who's like trying to find that balance because being vegan was part of the eating disorder, right? And
Right.
so when that happens, it can be really hard to go back and not
Mm-hmm.
bring the eating disorder with it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think it's really important to operate in a gray area, especially with something like the vegan diet, where it's okay to increase plant-based meals
Mm-hmm.
and also be really flexible about the fact that like sometimes that's not the food that's available and it's okay and you need to be okay with that and be okay with feeding yourself even when the vegan food is not
Ah,
available.
such a good point. And the good old word, which is so important, is flexibility, right?
Yes. Yeah.
What about people who come and talk about, being needing to be gluten free?
Right.
And how do you work with that? How do you deal with that? I mean, I know it's a sort of limiting question, but I'm just curious about
Mhm.
your thoughts about it.
Yeah. So gluten-free is sort of like keto, right? Like it
Hmm.
comes from a place of science-backed literature. People who have celiac disease can't have gluten foods. It, it's very clear, and it's clear, it's diagnosable, and then you can't eat it anymore.
Sorry, guys, we're having a quick
And there
freeze
are people.
moment there. Sorry, we lost you for a sec, Taryn.
Oh no.
It's okay, you're back.
Okay.
Let's go back to talking about gluten free.
Yes. So I was saying gluten-free comes from, right, like the gluten-free diet comes from celiac disease,
Right.
where people really can't have gluten. And some people feel like they are affected by gluten without a diagnosis of celiac disease. I think when that happens, it's really important to unpack what that means. So, like, what
Hmm.
our thoughts are around gluten, what our real symptoms are, and kind of decide like how can we balance being accepting and non-judgmental of foods and making sure that we feel good, which is part of intuitive eating. And I think that's
Hmm.
really important to emphasize, because some people look at intuitive eating as like just eat whatever, like
Hmm.
none of it matters. One of the last steps of intuitive eating is gentle nutrition, right? It's something that we work in as we become more accepting of foods. And part of that is like what makes you feel good when you eat
Right.
it.
Right.
And if that means eating less foods with gluten and just being mindful of that, I think that's a fine place to end up. But
Hmm.
you have to be willing to do the work of really unpacking like why do I feel that gluten is an issue?
Hmm. And that brings us into, I know you talked a little bit about intuitive eating, but can you just give a definition of what intuitive eating is?
Sure. So intuitive eating is the art of trusting your body to know what it needs and when it needs it, and
Hmm.
learning how to listen for those cues.
Hmm. Hmm. And when you get there, I know for me, life is so much more fulfilling. Taryn froze again. She's back. She's back. I was saying that like life is so much more fulfilling when you get there,
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
right? And living in that
absolutely.
place is just so much more freeing and gratifying
Mhm.
and, to be honest, fun,
Yeah, absolutely. I know, like for me, I feel like it changes your whole perspective.
right?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Well, I Taryn and I run a food and feelings group on Sundays, so we would love to have any of you who are interested join us. And Taryn also does some other groups with Health at Every Size, at Mindful Path, and a chronic dieters group. And you're also available for individual work, of course. And if you want to learn more about Taryn, you can go to mindfulpath.com, and Taryn's got a bio there and all kinds of good information and some videos. So take a look at that. And Taryn, let's do this again and talk about intuitive eating next time. I think it's
Yeah.
such an important topic.
Oh, I would love that.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
This was fun.
It was
Thank
fun. Thank
you.
you.
I hope you have a beautiful afternoon.
Oh, thank you. You too.
I will see you later. Take care. And again, visit us at mindfulpath.com. Thank you all. Bye bye.